this study session of the Littleton Licensing Authority to order. We have two study session topics. First is amendments to Title 3, Chapter 2 of the City Code, proposed amendments to Title 3, Chapter 2 of the City Code regarding liquor licensing, and the second one is potential change in the way we do stipulations. And I will hand it back over to staff, and if you all would like to walk us through those.
As far as the proposed amendments, changes, corrections, and deletions to the city code, Assistant City Attorney McClellan and I worked on that based on input from our last meeting, I believe in August, and then took all of your suggestions and compared some of it against what the state statute is. And so you'll see that there are actually some areas under conduct and establishment that we've completely removed because they're redundant. We do have some areas that are specific to Littleton, and we'll leave those in, but anything that was a redundancy of state statute, we're just going to get rid of it because it's kind of like the Twix commercial, you know, me a janitor and you a custodian. It's exactly the same thing. So it's, well, it is. And so this is what we're hoping is close to the final. We're hoping everyone had a chance to look at it, and if there was anything we missed or something else you wanted to suggest, because we're hoping to be able to bring this to you at our next regular meeting in its fully revised form with a resolution to adopt it as the licensing authority. And then once that's adopted by resolution of the licensing authority, we can take it to council.
We would be adopting a recommendation.
You would be adopting a recommendation for the changes, and then it would go to council as an ordinance on first and second reading.
Does the council have the ability to tweak it?
Yes. Absolutely.
It would start by going to a study session with council. All ordinances go to, or most ordinances will go to a study session.
Correct.
So it'll go to a study session with council. They'll have the opportunity to review it. There may be tweaks made at that point, and then it'll be brought to first and second reading.
What if they edit it and we don't agree with their edits?
Well, as council is the final authority, legislative authority in the city, it is their legal right to make any edits to the city code, barring those edits being illegal, but they are the final legislative authority for the city.
They would certainly look at the recommendations that we're making, and there would be a discussion as to why we're doing it. And hopefully they would take that into consideration. Now there may be some things that we want to take out of there that they want to leave in even though they're redundant. We're hoping that's not the case because we really do want to get it cleaned up and more streamlined.
Would this be the old council or the newly sworn in?
It would not go, if we do not bring it to you until November 8th, it would not go on a study session with council until probably early December, so it'd be the new council. And I think that as a whole within the city, we're kind of looking at business in relation to existing council and new council. Like we don't want to have, we're trying to finish up everything with one council so that we're not starting new business here and having it roll over. So it would all be with whoever is elected in November.
Sounds right. Since there weren't that many changes, would you mind could we walk through them? And
It shows the changes on here.
Oh,
yeah,
yes.
okay.
they're all red.
So
Right.
there is some changes you'll see to
The fee
the
schedule.
fee schedule, particularly adding in the lodging and entertainment license, which is a new form of license.
That we just issued.
Yes.
And if I could go back to that for just a minute, I know that you guys had asked for some clarification on the occupation tax and how it's derived and where it came from. And I wish I had a really clear answer for you. It was adopted, and oh, you're starting line, I don't have the date in front of me, but it was way back when council decided to initiate an occupation tax, which is also known as a head tax. It's the cost of doing business in Littleton. But we have not been able to successfully find any means by which it was calculated, nor has finance been able to help us with that, so.
I was recently, last couple days, looking at Inglewood's schedule of fees, and they seem to be less than half.
Really?
General range was about $300 or $400 for the hotel and restaurant license, and we're at $1080. Not that I'm opposed to the fees we have. Obviously, we have businesses, they pay it, the city has it as revenue. But, and I don't really think that there's many places that would go out and start a license tomorrow if we lowered it. But it is interesting that we're probably the highest fees that I've seen.
Well, and the majority of that is the occupation tax, and some cities don't have them. They've, the
Douglas
term is
County,
going
it's
to
like
be grouped.
$50.
Yeah. So,
Does it comply with taper?
I don't know that it's a,
Is it tax or fee?
I believe it's a fee, not
it's a
tax.
fee.
It complies with taper.
Yeah, it's a fee. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So, I think if we were ever going to make that go away, that would have to be a very lengthy discussion with council.
One thing we maybe should have brought up in the staff reports was currently state liquor is doing some rulemaking on the lodging and entertainment license. So there may be some changes in the rulemaking coming down the pipe having to do with that license. It's only been around for,
It's very new, it's
Very
actually
new,
only
and,
been in existence.
it's having some
Less
I think,
than a
growing
year.
pains. And so they're dealing with that at state liquor right now.
Mostly about what kinds of businesses are going to fit under that umbrella. There are some that are very obvious. An event center is very obvious. A hotel is very obvious. They're allowing spas, places like that, bowling alleys, things that, but areas that are kind of being left out on the fringes are coffee shops and tea shops and things like that that want to do infused beverages. And most of those that have licenses now have tavern licenses, but because they have narrowed their definition of what a tavern license is, anyone that currently is operating under that isn't going to be able to transfer their business under that license.
And any new business wanting to get a
They
license.
can't, yeah. So they're trying to kind of,
So some of the current licensees in the city might transfer to a lodging and
well,
entertainment.
the opportunity for them to do that at no cost has passed. They still have an option to do it. We actually only have 2 businesses in the city that would have been impacted, going from a tavern license to a lodging and entertainment. And neither one of them opted to do it. One is a spa, it's the Woodhouse Day Spa, and the other is NT down on Main Street.
So the next change was the removal of what was formerly number 12 in that list about the sale after the hours of 8 p.m. until 12 on Sundays and Christmas. A few changes to 3-2-6. Just some updates in 3-2-8 to link to the correct Colorado revised statute. And then there was some changes in special event permits because we moved those wholly to city control. We're no longer working with the state on special event permits.
And what we mean by that is we still inform them when we issue a special event permit, but we no longer have to send them to state for issuance and approval. It's strictly a local matter.
You can speak more to the changes in possession in or upon licensed premises. That was just a wording change.
Yeah, and that was just, and I want to say that that was Authority Member Levere that talked about the changes of the wording, just an agent versus,
Yeah, because we referenced a licensee on an unlicensed premises, and there, in an unlicensed premises, there is no licensee.
right,
Right.
right. That was semantics.
Yes. We removed the section about the distribution of legal information with kegs of beer.
And why the removal?
Because it's not a state statute and it's just kind of been carried over. Because, again, this part of code hasn't been updated in its entirety. There have been pieces of it.
Well, in that particular section, I believe, looks like it was implemented in 1985, so it's been a few years. And
This brings us to 3-2-11.
yes.
A7, which we talked about.
Conduct.
What was the...
So the short story is we reached out to state LED to discuss this section.
And real quick, just as a reminder, we had talked about this previously. The idea is that we do have a licensee in the city who shows movies.
Yes.
Some of the content of which may be could be in violation with this, which was probably created for a very different purpose. Sorry.
So we spoke with state. We had some somewhat lengthy conversations.
Can open worms everywhere.
Clerk Norton did. So this ran parallel to some language that's in state statute as well. So one of the reasons that we decided to get rid of it is because it already exists in state statute, and so we can default back to state. But I will say that state LED's policy at this point in time is to not enforce this language in state statutes because there is some concerns with violating First Amendment rights. And so they are choosing at this point to not enforce this language in their own statutes.
And they're actually, in their latest rulemaking, they have introduced some new language that pretty much negates everything that it says up above.
And
so
we would be happy to provide you with that, with a draft of that rulemaking,
of what it looks like.
so that you all can see what state has done.
So they're invoking the ostrich statute.
Well, it's. I mean, there is starting to be precedent set for lawsuits for people winning
There was,
Utah, which
is not necessarily binding in Colorado, but it's just sort of gives an idea of a trend. There was a movie theater in Utah that brought a claim against, was it the state liquor or a local licensing authority? I cannot remember.
The state liquor brought
state liquor.
Yeah.
violation, and they fought.
And they fought the
violation.
violation, and they won in the courts in Utah, I believe, on a First Amendment claim.
Because part of the problem with this part of the code too is art galleries were impacted by it. And anyone who's been to an art gallery, I mean, some art, it's nudes or whatever, and there have been lawsuits filed against art galleries. And they've lost because, again, it's First Amendment rights. So actually it was a great educational opportunity for us. So thank you for opening the big old giant can of worms.
You're welcome. Just as part of the mechanics, do you have input in that process through either the Clerks Association or CML?
I'm sorry.
Do you have input into the process of LED's rule setting?
Actually, I do attend rulemaking meetings along with other clerks, and so I think that they're fairly open to hearing, what's actually happening in the world, and I think that they do take it under advisement. At the end of the day, I don't know how much weight it carries, but I think our voices are heard. Yeah.
So we will make sure to get you all a copy of those proposed rulemaking that relates to the similar language in state
Right.
statutes, you can see how the state is dealing with this issue. The next thing was the removal of the use by local licensing authority of financial information authorization and release.
Bless you.
Then in what is now 3-2-19, failure to appear in response to process, there was some spelling fixes and the addition of Jefferson County. Somebody caught the fact that we had...
Well, and again, back in '85, we had not yet annexed the enclave of Trailmark, so we didn't have addresses in Jefferson County. So, again, the guy with the can opener over there.
Sorry. I'm not done yet either.
We wouldn't expect you to be.
Let's see, a few minor changes.
Yeah, I think most of the rest of it is just grammatical and just cleanup.
I believe that's it. For any major changes.
Any thoughts or questions from
I mean, you guys want to get into it deeper? Are you happy with where we're starting?
Would you like to see the rulemaking from the state before we bring this back to you?
Only if it's contrary to what we
So all we've done is,
already have set as a policy.
Yeah,
it would not be.
Right, because we've removed it from our local code, so it would automatically default to whatever the state code is currently and will be once they're done with rulemaking.
I'm okay with the change. I don't see it becoming a huge problem here in Littleton.
Okay?
I have two undiscussed things then from previous
Okay.
attempts at this. Because I like it as it is, and I think whatever we decide tonight, you should just bring back to us next month and as final, and then we'll up or down. But then for these two things I'm about to raise, I think just do hands up or down, whether to put those into final for next month. Going to 3-2-8, employees of establishment. I would actually almost propose deleting this in entirety and leaving it up to state statute. I don't see anything like this in any of the other municipal codes, and I think there's a large discrepancy. I mean, we had our Circle K this evening say they check felonies, maybe we go back 10 years. This statute doesn't have a 10-year time frame. It says if you were in the 80s or in the 60s
Right.
convicted of felony drug possession, a joint, and even today, if you were in Oklahoma, a single marijuana joint would get you a felony conviction today under their current state laws. I think, not only, I don't know even if we are enforcing this, if we have any ways to audit or check who our establishments are employing. I think this is a kind of a mean and burdensome regulation, and we can do our businesses a favor by just deleting it.
Am I wrong, or in the state of California, a DUI is a felony now?
I am not sure.
It can be, but it wouldn't be covered by what's written here, because what is written here
Title
is
18 is
controlled
criminal.
substances.
And Title 18 is the criminal code, I believe, if I'm remembering all of my Colorado Revised statutes correctly.
I don't see this being as much of a problem. I don't know that we should be in the business of telling them who they can employ. We already have our standards for who the licensee is.
And we also do background checks on the managers as well.
Managers.
Well, we do background, for a new license, we're going to do a background check on anyone who holds more than 10% plus the registered manager. And then at renewals, we do backgrounds on the manager and we check on the establishment. So Okay, so, did you want to kind of go around and get a consensus, or do we want to come forward with it still in there?
I think my recommendation is complete deletion, and I'm proposing this to the board here. Because this is directly about the employees of the establishment, it has nothing to do with the manager. Well, I guess the manager would fall under as an employee, but if you have an owner, this wouldn't even apply to the owner or the licensee. And the only things that are said about the licensee is,
The licensee has to be of good moral character.
and that gives us the discretion to say, sure, you had a felony conviction in '85 and nothing since, and you're a good, upstanding person now, so we're okay with it. But this isn't written to give the employees of that same licensee that same discretion.
I agree. I agree on removing it too.
Is this topic, use of this topic is covered in state statute?
I haven't even seen it in
It's not in state statute to this extent.
It's not in,
State statute really just talks about good moral character and reputation of the licensee or the applicant.
which is where I think our focus should be.
There's even rental laws now. You can't discriminate on someone that had a felony past 7 years ago.
And if nothing else, we should, if we are opposed to the idea of just deleting it entirely, we should put a time frame limitation for better guidance.
I would advise if you decide to keep some permutation of this, that you do add some sort of time frame.
So I think
Be it 7 years or 10.
right. So I think the decision needs to be: do we put in a time frame, and is that an arbitrary time frame, or do we have something that was substantiated, or do we just get rid of it?
And if we put in a time frame, so what? What does that mean?
Right, because again,
Someone
how
hires somebody
are we
and
going to
you're
monitor
over it.
that?
We don't police it. We shouldn't be policing it.
Yeah.
And if someone files a complaint, is it really even our role? We're
Right.
licensing, not monitoring
Right.
their employment stuff. And it's already covered us. If it's in the CSR, right, or the CRS, then covered by the statutes.
Well, we're saying it's not a revised statute, it's not the employee.
Right.
Oh, not to this extent.
Not to
So
this
we're
extent.
going even a little.
Yeah.
Well, so as the dual licensing, we are allowed, so state is a floor, not a ceiling.
Right.
So we are allowed to be more strict than state statute, not.
We can't be more lenient, we can be more restrictive. But again, this was put back there in 1985, and who knows how many licenses existed in this town in '85. I can pretty much guarantee not the number that we have now.
You know, and my other thing, if you look at the second half of this statute, it addresses, okay, so the first part covers felony convictions for possession or sale of drugs on the controlled substance list. The second part covers felony convictions for organized crime involving gambling, prostitution, and pimping. Why are we picking out those three specifically? Why aren't we talking about anything else
Right.
that is of a abhorrent nature?
And it has nothing to do with liquor enforcement. It doesn't mention bootlicking, unlawful sales, violation of any other liquor code.
Right.
It's, yeah, I think it's an anachronism, it's a 1985 anachronism.
Yeah, I'd be in favor, certainly, or especially because I don't see how we could enforce it. I know we obviously don't. And I think it would be very difficult to actually enforce it. So I'd be
You
okay
want
with.
to go around and just give us a
Sure.
Up, down,
down,
whatever.
heads up, 7 up?
Yeah, so thumbs down is get rid of it?
Yeah, I would delete it.
Okay.
Delete.
I would remove it.
Delete it.
I'm into remove and not putting enough a year.
Banish it.
All right.
All right.
Okay, you had another one?
Number two, when I was looking at other municipal codes around for local authorities, I stumbled across Lone Tree. Stumbling in my case was directly going there and searching it out.
I like the way you stumble.
They have a very interesting approach because they're basically 100% state statutes, and then they had like 4 revisions for their own states. And one of them, which I really kind of liked, that we have no comparison on ours is they have a provision for food, drink, and alcohol beverage prices, and I'll just read this out. Alcohol beverage prices menus shall be provided to patrons on request, which shall legibly set forth the price of food, drink, or alcohol beverages available, together with any minimum purchase requirement or charge for admission, and any applicable admissions tax collected. No greater charge shall be made than that shown on such menu. And I think this is a good consumer protection. And especially with kind of the way Littleton is growing, we now have the tavern, we now have some other places. I think this is a nice addition. And it would just be a recommendation. It might, I don't know that I would say bring it back in the final form, but I would maybe somehow add it as a supplement for council to consider.
Nothing in state about that.
No, because
That seems weird.
in my opinion, it's a little bit stepping into the boundaries of telling someone how to run their business.
In most bars, people aren't asking for menus either. They're asking for beers or whatever they're drinking.
Yeah, I mean, I get the reasoning behind it. I just don't know. I mean, we certainly could put it in the communication as a recommendation, but what justification are we going to put behind that?
Perhaps we could do some research and ask if Lone Tree, what their experience has been with it, and do they enforce it? If it's just language that's in there and they don't follow through on it, then what's the point?
And they're a little smaller too.
And
But they
I'd be
have
interested
a more
to know
significant
where it's
sales
paid,
volume.
like,
Well, what I was going to say was I'd be interested to know to what degree does it actually protect consumers? Because putting a charge on a menu doesn't mean that you're charging someone a fair price. So there's not a whole lot of transparency just by putting a number on a menu. You could still be charging them a 400% markup. I mean, you know.
Well, I mean, I would assume that it's in there to prevent someone from sitting down, ordering a beer that they thought might cost $4 or $5, and they go to pay and it costs 10. I mean, I've never experienced that in Littleton. So.
I have read quite a few other jurisdictions' liquor codes, and I have not seen anything like this in anybody else's code. So I don't know what Lone Tree's reasoning or experience is.
I mean, I'm certainly willing to reach out to the clerk and find out what the impetus was for it.
I think where the problems kind of hit the road usually are with, I would say, places that have high-scale wine. They've got, I don't know if they've got Fleming's, but they've got that really nice restaurant in the Vistas at Park Meadows. You can get a wine list, and there'll never be a price on the wine list. And you get...
But how is that any different than getting a menu that says lobster is market price? You don't know what market price is. They could charge you whatever. So how is that any different? I mean,
alcohol doesn't really have a market price.
no, but I mean, not putting a price on there I don't see as any different than that standard tagline of market price. I mean,
Well, wine might have a market price now that San Francisco's all on fire.
Why don't we do this?
It's also, if nothing else, it might be, I'm going to charge you $100 for the bottle of wine. I'm going to say that I sold it for $50 and paid sales tax on that $50, as opposed to the 100. But it's not something I'm 100% in love with. It's just an idea.
Where do this?
If
Probably not checking menus either.
If this is something you're interested in getting information about, we would be happy to reach out to Lone Tree just to see if they can explain to us what the reasoning was behind this and how they've gone about enforcing, if at all.
because we may find that it's just there and they haven't.
And then we can let you all know what answers we found, and that may change how the authority feels about that section as a potential addition to the code.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can reach out tomorrow. Yeah.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say for next month, then bring back everything else as final form, and then whatever you find out on that, we can consider as a side addendum.
Okay, we can do that.
Because I don't think we should delay that any further.
Right.
That's what we have.
We would be happy to do that for you.
Absolutely.
All right, the next item for consideration is a potential change to the way we handle stipulation. And we have the background, and it's available online, but do you want to give a quick intro as to...
I can do it. Go. So these stipulation agreement and orders, you guys see them when we have a violation. They are negotiated through the city prosecutor with the licensee. After you guys have determined that there's probable cause, then the prosecutor will call them into the office, her office, Tricia, if you all know Tricia, and they'll talk about the stipulation agreement. So at this point in time, the authority sets the dates of suspension and determines the dates for any fine in lieu at the preliminary hearing after the prosecutor has reached the stipulation agreement and order. Deputy Clerk Norton and I have done some research looking at the way state handles this. Did you look at any other cities, or was it just state LED?
I just looked at state. Mostly my curiosity was piqued because we get copies anytime one of our licensees has a state violation. And so, what's happening now is the prosecutor will determine how many days of suspension, 10 days, 15 days, if a fine in lieu for any portion of it. And you know that when it comes to you, you can either accept it as is or deny it or discuss to modify it. But what ends up happening is then we set future dates based around the same day of the week that the violation happened, kind of thing. What state does is they look at your violation was in July. They don't care what day of the week it was. So they get all your receipts for July and they figure out what your average daily gross was. And then if they are doing a 10-day suspension with 5 held in abeyance and a fine in lieu for the 5 days, they know that maybe your average every day was 1,500 times 5. Well, it would be 7,500, but it can't be more than 5,000. So they would pay the cap. And I like that because I think it's cleaner going in, that we're not trying to negotiate dates in the future and is it going to impact you because it's Western Welcome Week or, those kinds of things.
One of the things that we liked about this process versus the way that it's being done now is that we feel that it's a more fair representation of the business that they were doing at the time where the violation actually occurred. Because if you are, for example, if your violation occurred in July during your busiest time, and then you're not doing your, at the way we do it now, let's say you didn't end up coming before the authority until October, and then you're setting your fine on dates based in October, well, maybe you don't actually do the same business in October that you did in July, and we felt it was a more fair representation to base the fine off of the days, off of the month in which the violation actually occurred.
Makes sense.
Can't that happen now, though?
Well, the issue is that the authority at this point sets usually the fine and lieu suspension based on dates in the future. So if
we could just do this now, but you're bringing it to us.
Well, we could do it as a process, but we're also going to have to get the prosecutor's office on board with it.
And you're asking us before you bring it back.
we
to
were
us
just looking for the authority to
So there's no
give their opinion on that process.
Change to the ordinance or anything.
No. This is not like an official change to anything. This is a
Right.
process change.
It's their decisions
And
anyway.
we would be updating our stipulation and agreement and order and working with Tricia to update that and we're just bringing this to you guys as a potential process change. Because at the end of the day, you guys are the ones that approved the stipulation.
Yeah, it's strictly a process change, and I think too it would offer you clearer information
Right. To
at,
actually see it.
at the preliminary to kind of understand, without having to, everybody's got their little phones out and their calendars and trying to, and it also does away with the waiting period for me to notify them of their dates, and then days to get the receipts in, and then they have 10 days beyond that, and
then they could know in advance, I'm facing this fine in lieu,
right.
potentially. And I know what that number is, or if I want to fight or take it out.
Right.
I know by the time they came to you after the stipulation agreement had already been negotiated, they would know already what the month of violation was, what the dates were that were being used to calculate the amount.
And
that
what
would
their
all
due
be
date
known
was.
in advance instead of after.
Right.
And you say this is the way the state is doing it?
Correct.
So for example, with our last violation that you saw, I believe the date of the actual violation was in
I'd have to go back.
It was May.
May or something like
Yeah.
that, and you didn't see them until August.
or whatever it was.
And
yeah.
their dates of suspension
Yeah,
were
it
not
was
set
in August.
until August.
Right.
So you can see that there's a bit of a disconnect between
Yeah, it makes sense.
when you're calculating that. And for the licensee as well.
Seems easier for everyone.
I don't have any problem.
I just like that we go back to state statute anyway, and why don't we just follow the state?
I don't know that this is codified, this process is codified anywhere in state, but this is the way
It's
that
their-
state,
it's their
this is their
practice.
practice and process.
Consistency across
It's
the
up to the
Right.
prosecutor anyway.
Well, it is up to the prosecutor to an extent, and I think what we would do, our next step after this would certainly be to engage with the prosecutor and with possibly the city attorney as well, just to make sure that he's good
I'm in
with
favor of it just because it kind of takes away the guessing of whether we're being punitive or not. Makes it standard.
I have one other process issue. With apologies to Lena, and I'm not a lawyer, but I play a good one in the licensing authority. I was a little surprised in reading this and really dissecting it. There's not a stipulation in here from the licensee that acknowledges that they have been given the license, that they knew what the terms of the license are, and that the licensing authority has the jurisdiction to enforce the license. That needs to be between 3 and 4. Where it says 4 admits the violation, well, they also need to acknowledge that we have the authority to set this action. That we issued them a license, they should know what the provisions of the license are, and that they're required to keep the provisions of the license.
So you're recommending that when we modify our stipulation agreement in order that we add that piece in?
Now, when we add something that says the licensee acknowledges that they've been issued a license, that they are cognizant of the requirements of the license, and that the licensing authority has the ability to impose these strictures. I just think it makes it clear.
Well,
that
sanctions.
The sanctions,
The
yeah.
sanctions, including suspension up to revocation, which
Yeah.
is actually stated on the bottom of their licenses.
Then I
So-
think it needs to be in the stipulation.
Lena? Yeah.
I will look into some language.
Because we've gone through this
I
in
can
a
pull
couple
some
other
licenses.
major licenses and suspensions. And I think Tricia always put that into the language, the final language, that they acknowledged that they were at risk or that they were at fault.
Well, one of the
Well,
samples in here
sorry.
is ours.
Right, just to be clear, you're not necessarily, you provided the sample from state just to look at the section.
We provided
You're not
our
necessarily
Yeah,
saying.
we provided
right.
a state sample and our sample.
No, I know, but the one from state, you're not necessarily saying this will be our new template, you're just saying that section. Right. So
Right.
just to your point, so whatever Trish uses, she could continue to use for that part.
Yeah.
We would just adjust it a little bit. And so, our hearing structure wouldn't change. We'd still have probable cause. We would still schedule a preliminary hearing before show cause in case there was a stipulation. But at least that way, someone coming into a stipulation would understand what's on the table. And the authority would also have sufficient time to look at, this is approximately what the fine is going to be, and this is when it's due, and is that, enough of a penalty? But you guys would still have the opportunity to say, we don't like 5 held in abeyance, we only want to hold 3 in abeyance, and we think they should be paying 2 more days. And, so you're still going to have some negotiating room. I just think it's a much cleaner.
And the state example actually has something like this. Licensee acknowledges receipt of sufficient notice, statement of advisement of rights, process of the proceedings, wishes to resolve all issues,
Right. So we can cabbage a little bit from that, and then kind of, and Lena will look for some language. But I think if we're going to look at refining the process, now is probably a good time to refine the actual document as well.
All right, any other thoughts on that? Any other thoughts for the good of the order? You said we will have a regularly scheduled meeting next month?
We do. We currently have 1 new license for the Residence Inn. Will be your second lodging and entertainment license. And we still have 1 pending that I've had in my drawer since February. It's a coffee shop over on Rapp called Roots. Dirt Coffee.
Dirt,
yeah. Roots is their
non-profit.
not-for-profit. Yeah, Roots, Colorado. And they're just still toying with open dates and permits and things like that. So at this date, it will not be coming forward in November. So realistically, it might not be until after
What's
the
their
first
delay,
some permitting issues and lease stuff, and so they stay in contact with me. So yeah, so right now we just have 1 new one in November. We tried really hard to get them on tonight's regular meeting, but we just couldn't make it. So because they are looking at our November hearing is November 8th, and their original target date was November 7th, but they've been pushed back a few days, so they're cutting it really close.
I hate to be the bird in your saddle, but we have yet to ever hear from the police department about why they're not doing enforcement stings, compliance checks, secret shopping, whatever you want to call them. We haven't seen one in over a year.
Yes, it's been a while.
Yeah, is it not a priority? Are they not?
I can't.
That we can speak to that.
Yeah, I can't speak to what I can.
Did you invite them to come?
I could invite them to come to the November meeting. I will talk to Chief Stevens and see if he wants to attend or if he wants to send someone who can address
That'd be great.
those issues. Yeah.
I would assume they're dealing with larger issues.
Yeah.
We can speak to
Yeah.
that.
If you get multiple calls at a location, I'm sure they'd make it a priority.
I mean,
Well,
they're walking through the tavern and view house all the time, but we're not hearing anything. I mean, that's a good thing, but
Yeah. No, it'd be good to hear. I mean, if they are out doing things and we just start seeing it, then
Yeah, we will reach out to Chief Stevens and ask him if either he or one of his designees can come to our November 8th meeting and address some of those issues and concerns.
okay.
Are you aware of anything happening at the old mill location? It's
Nothing.
just dormant and blacked out?
It's just dormant. There are a couple of transfers happening right now. Pho Real Victor has sold the business, so we have a new owner in there.
is that the one I made?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And so their transfer is in process. Sushi Basho, I have an application coming in next week to transfer that license as well.
If so,
Yeah, they'll have a new owner at Sushi Basho. So I have an application coming in on that next week. And then the other one, I have had discussion with a potential new business going into the old Delizio / Columbine on Main location. So.
So they found a renter?
So there are some things happening downtown.
All right, cool. Anything else? All right, this study session is adjourned. Thank you all.
Okay.
Thank you very much for all your research.